A whole bunch of different companies out there make wargaming terrain, and recently Weird decided to dip their toes into that area with their Weirdscapes line. And I'm not going to bury the lead here. This is easily some of the nicest terrain that I own, but there's a lot more to it than that, and there are some drawbacks to it, so we're going to get into all that in a minute. But just to touch on some of the basics right here up front, the Weirdscapes terrain is plastic kits that come on a sprue. So this is hard plastic, not dissimilar to the plastic that you see the Malifaux models made out of. And all the different sets come on a sprue that you have to clip out, put together, and paint yourself. There's not a whole ton of variety, but there are a couple of different options for buildings, a set with staircases, and then some random bits of scatter terrain, as well as these smaller, more like demolished looking buildings. Now this stuff is all obviously perfect for Malifaux or the other side, and it's themed to look like it belongs in those universes, so it definitely makes a lot of sense to use for those games. But I think you get away with using this stuff for a variety of fantasy or steampunk or pulp games. Especially if you paint them up in different styles, I think you could get these to work pretty well in a pretty wide variety of game types. Now, when Weird originally pitched this line of terrain, they showed this really cool concept for a whole bunch of different buildings, as well as a bunch of street tiles that can make a layout on a 3x3 board and look really cool as a table for a Malifaux game. Now, they put out the whole current line of Weirdscapes terrain in one shot, and so far they haven't added anything to that line. So I don't know if we're ever going to get the rest of the stuff that we see here, although I think it would be pretty cool because this multi-layer setup is pretty dope. And the current stuff that they have out now is just not quite enough to fill up a whole table. So I'm hoping that they'll put out some more kits in the future. There's a big building here that's definitely missing, and I think having those street tiles would add a lot to the whole set if you wanted to have one ready-to-go table just on the Weirdscapes terrain. This is definitely really good for playing out a game that takes place in Malifaux City, whether it be somewhere on the outskirts of downtown or in a more high-class area of the slums. And if you're playing in another setting, then of course you can make this work for your own purposes, because it's sort of this combination of destroyed-looking buildings as well as complete structures. The footprint of the terrain varies a little bit, which I think is pretty useful because it means that you can use this stuff in a skirmish style game as well as in a larger game. The buildings go from ones that are only a few inches on each side to this larger one that'll be a pretty nice centerpiece in a skirmish table. And then the little bits and pieces of scatter terrain can be used to break up the table even more. I will say I do think that the set could use a little bit more scatter terrain, but that's something that I'll get to in just a minute. So let's talk about the pros of the Weirdscapes terrain. First of all, this is some of the highest quality terrain that I have ever seen. It is extremely highly detailed. Every surface of every building is covered in all sorts of little details like notices that are nailed to doors, broken windows, flags, ropes, little bits of decay and destruction, all sorts of really interesting stuff. The plastic is really thick and nice quality, and the stuff is pretty sturdy, so you probably don't have to worry about breaking the larger pieces once they're assembled, except for the exception of some of the little teeny pieces that jut out on the sides, because those you could very easily break. Another thing that I really like about this terrain is that because it is plastic, it's actually super easy to paint up. If you've ever tried to paint MDF terrain, I find that it can be very difficult because even after you prime it, the paint doesn't really stay on it the way that you want it to. But if you painted any plastic models, then you already know what to do with this terrain. Another nice thing about the plastic versus something like MDF is that you don't get the edges where two pieces join together and you see that strange little gap. Because they're plastic, they all kind of join up pretty well. It is a little bit tricky to assemble some of the kits because you are basically building a box and it's enclosed on all sides. But once you get them assembled, it looks really clean and really nice. And the other thing that I really love about this set is that it's all totally modular. The three big buildings that they sell come with a base building and then a roof part that goes on top of them. But even once they're assembled, each one of those is fully interchangeable and you can swap them onto the other buildings to give it a little bit of a more interesting look. Plus, you can even stack them on top of each other and make one giant tower structure if you're a crazy person. You definitely want to be careful that you don't knock this over while you're playing. It's going to get in the way, but it looks pretty awesome, so that's cool. The stairs are a little bit weird because they don't really match up perfectly with the other buildings and things in the set, but if you have some elevated terrain or other things that you want to use with it, they might work well, depending on what it is that you want to do with them. I think the stairs were intended for if they sold the street tiles because you could add the elevation that way, but as they stand, I haven't really found much use for them. And because of everything that I just listed, it makes for a really cool looking table. It's a little bit light if you just have one of each of the sets as far as coverage goes for a 3x3 table, but it is very cool looking and it definitely gives you those good Malifaux vibes that you want. Now, on the other hand, there are a couple of things that I would say are a con, so let's talk a little bit about those as well. First of all, this is a premium product and it is priced as such. If you're looking for a cheap way to get a table set up for a skirmish game, this is probably not the best option. The MSRP on the full line of Weirdscapes stuff is just shy of $300, and like I said, that's barely enough to cover a full table. Now, you can use the roofs of the buildings as separate structures and kind of get a little bit more density out of it that way, which isn't a terrible idea. Some of the stuff looks actually really cool sitting on the ground by itself. But even at that, $300 for a table's worth of terrain, you can definitely find cheaper options elsewhere. But keep in mind, they are not going to look as nice, and they are not going to be as high quality as this stuff. Again, I would not consider this a budget-focused line of terrain. It's definitely a premium product. Now, the next thing that I want to point out as a con is that some of the bits on this terrain are extremely fragile. I mentioned before that this stuff is pretty sturdy, and that is true of the main structure of all of the buildings. I could probably almost stand on some of this stuff and not have it crush. But that's not true of a lot of the little incidental bits that stick out on a lot of this stuff. Because the terrain is so detailed, that there are so many little flags and bars and ropes and things just kind of hanging off in random directions, that it can be really easy to accidentally snap them off. On top of that, it actually makes storing them pretty difficult, because even though the terrain stacks, there's very few flush edges, so when you put them in a box, there's usually going to be pressure on one of these little flimsy pieces, and then eventually you're going to break them off. I'd actually broken off a couple of different pieces of like lanterns and flags and things like that, and while I was filming for this video, I broke another little piece off. I don't think it's enough of a con to really take away from the overall effect, because a lot of these pieces you barely notice anyway, and frankly, having some of the stuff be broken, I think adds to the effect of the kind of spooky, sort of slightly haunted looking town. But it is something to keep in mind, because it can be a little frustrating if you spend a bunch of money on this terrain and then you put it away in a box, and the first time you go to take it out, you find that a bunch of pieces just broke off. You can always go back and glue the stuff back together, but honestly, I had it break again so many times that I just gave up and decided not to bother. And the last thing that I want to count as a con for this range is that I think it is incomplete. There's just not enough kits in the set to really make it pop the way that I think it could have. Going back to that concept art that they originally put out, this is a really cool looking board, and I'd be really jazzed to play out a game on this table, but unfortunately, there's just not enough stuff available to recreate it in real life. Even if you buy duplicates of a couple of the sets, you're not going to have the same effect, because you're not going to have the raised street levels, and you're really not going to have a use for a lot of the stairs that you get in one of the boxes. Plus, I think it could use more scatter terrain. You get 4 of these little fences as well as the fountain, and those are really cool, but I would like a little bit more of that kind of thing. Some more stuff that kind of ties in with the rest of the theme and can kind of bulk out a table and break up more of those lines of sight. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you can't buy one of these sets and just add it to your existing terrain collection, or buy all of them and put together your own table. I just think that it had a lot more potential to be even cooler if there was 1 or 2 more kits in the set. Now, overall, I think this whole set is really awesome. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is some of the nicest terrain that I own, and I have a pretty extensive collection of terrain myself. I've had multiple games that I've played personally where I mix this terrain in with some of the other terrain that I have, and almost every single time my opponents will walk over and make a comment on how the Wyrdscapes terrain kind of looks out of place with the rest of the terrain, because it's so much nicer, it's so much more detailed, and it's so much more interesting looking than your typical kind of budget level wargaming terrain. Another weird thing that I wanted to point out with this stuff is, and I'm not sure whether this counts as a pro or a con, it's just weird to me, is that every single one of these buildings has a fully detailed interior. Each one of the buildings has a little kind of diorama going on inside of it, where there's tables and chairs and equipment and barrels and all kinds of stuff. And it's really cool, but the problem is that none of that stuff is really in a playable space. You can just barely fit a 30mm model in most of the interiors of these buildings, and there's not really an easy entry or exit point for you to play out any kind of real game in the interior. Now, of course, you can build the buildings and not fully glue them together so that you can split them open and play out RPGs inside of them, I guess, or maybe use them as dioramas or for taking pictures. I'm not really sure what they were going for here. It seems like a lot of effort went into modeling these interiors, and it's kind of wasted. Like, sure, it's cool that you can look down inside of them and see that there's stuff going on, but it's a real pain to paint, and there's not really much that adds to the purpose that they play in the actual game. I'm sure some people like it just because it looks cool, and it gives you that sense of immersion when you're looking at the terrain, even if you can only see a little bit of the interior. But to me, I would have rather the interiors just be blank and spend some of that time and effort putting out another building or adding those street tiles that we missed out on. I don't know if those two things are equivalent, that's just my opinion. But anyway, let me know what you think of the Wyrdscapes terrain. Do you have any of it yourself? What do you think of it if you do? And if you don't, do you think that you might be interested in picking some up after watching this video? I plan to do videos like this covering a whole bunch of different companies that make terrains, so be sure to get down in the comments below and let me know which companies you'd like to see me do a video on. Don't forget to drop me a like and make sure you subscribe to the channel, as well as checking out all the important links in the description below, especially my Weird affiliate link, where if you want to pick up some of this terrain, you can shop through that link and it will actually support the channel with any purchases that you make. You can also support the Patreon, where you can support the channel directly and get a whole bunch of different benefits on all the different tiers. And on that note, I would like to send a huge thank you to the extremely cool kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, Devin, and the Spilled Paint Pot. And thanks for watching.